King Solomon. You know the name. Always linked with wisdom, wealth, and just a hint of something more, like magic maybe. So today we are really going to take a deep dive into this whole King Solomon thing. Was he a wise ruler, someone amazing with magic, or maybe, and this is interesting, a fascinating mix of both?
See, that's what makes Solomon's story really interesting, you know?
Yeah.
You've got the king, the builder, the magician, all these different sides to him. And these stories, they're everywhere, across time, across cultures. People are still debating them, still writing about them, still trying to figure him out.
And that is exactly why we are here. We are going deep into all kinds of sources, what the Bible says, how Jewish and Islamic traditions see him, the folklore, even how art portrays him. We'll look at the history, the legends, the whole thing, to really get a sense of who this King Solomon really was.
It's about going deeper. You see, it's not just the same old story. It's about how his reputation changed over time, how his story became this kind of blank slate that different cultures use to explore their own beliefs about wisdom, power, and the unseen world.
Okay, so let's start with something I think most of our listeners will be familiar with. Solomon's legendary wisdom. We're talking about that famous scene in the Book of Kings where God appears to Solomon in a dream and offers him anything he wants. Now, you might think a young king would go straight for, I don't know, being unbeatable in battle, never-ending riches.
Yeah, you'd think so, right? I mean, talk about a tempting offer. But what Solomon chooses, it tells us something really important about who he was, about how he understood what it meant to be a real leader.
Exactly. Instead of asking for something for himself, Solomon asks for wisdom so he can rule fairly and justly. And of course, this impresses God, who gives him not just wisdom, but also all those riches and a long, successful reign. But, you know, what's really interesting here isn't just God's favor, it's that this moment sets the tone for Solomon's entire rule.
Absolutely. It's like a foundation.
Right.
This one act shows how wisdom, wealth, and divine favor are all connected in Solomon's reign. And this idea, it really resonates in Jewish tradition. It's why he's seen as the ideal ruler.
And it's important to remember that this wisdom, it wasn't just some abstract concept, right? It showed up in how Solomon made judgments. His ability to handle really complicated situations with this almost like supernatural understanding. Think about that story everyone knows, the one with the two women both claiming to be the mother of the same baby.
Yes. That story is classic Solomon. The stakes are so high, right? It's all about finding out the truth, and it gives you a real sense of Solomon's wisdom as a judge. The way he solves it, it might seem strange, but it just shows you how deeply he understood people and his willingness to challenge the usual way of doing things.
Threatening to cut a baby in half. Yeah, they definitely don't teach you that one in law school, but it worked.
Yeah.
You see the real mother's love and compassion. And just like that, Solomon's known as a king who can see through lies and make sure justice wins. But the thing is, the deeper we go into Solomon's story, we find another layer, something more mysterious and honestly much more intriguing, his connection to magic.
And this is where it really gets interesting. The Bible itself doesn't outright say Solomon did magic, but there are these hints, these clues about him having knowledge that's almost, well, supernatural. But it's in the later writings and traditions that this idea of Solomon as a magical figure really takes root and blossoms.
Okay, so we're moving from wise judgments to something a little more, how do we say, mystical. Let's unpack that a bit. What are some of the first clues, the breadcrumbs that lead us down this path of Solomon as a magical figure?
One really striking example is the building of the first temple in Jerusalem, a huge and ambitious project. The Bible talks about these incredible materials and craftsmanship, and it all adds to this feeling of wonder around the whole thing.
So the sheer size and magnificence of the temple, this architectural wonder, that itself might have made people think Solomon had knowledge beyond the ordinary.
Exactly. And you have to think about what it meant back then, right? In a world where knowledge really was power, being able to design and build something so amazing, well, people might have seen that as almost magical in itself.
It's like they say, any technology that's advanced enough, it's going to look like magic. But it goes beyond just architecture, right? We have to talk about that symbol, probably the most famous one connected with Solomon, the seal of Solomon.
Ah, yes. The seal. Usually it's a hexagram or a pentagram. And, it's actually older than Solomon himself, but it becomes so strongly tied to him, to his story. You find it carved into ancient buildings and medieval books about magic, even today in some, let's say, more esoteric traditions.
It's like the symbol itself has power, some kind of mystery that goes beyond time and culture. But what does it really mean when it comes to Solomon? Why is this his symbol?
Well, that's where we move from these kind of hints and whispers to actual stories. The Bible itself doesn't connect Solomon directly to the seal, but later texts do, like the Testament of Solomon. And that's where we meet a Solomon who's much more obviously magical. He commands demons, understands the secrets of the slows, and he's got this ring that's filled with divine power.
Hold on a second. The Testament of Solomon. Now, for anyone listening who might not be familiar with that, it's not part of the traditional Bible, not like the Book of Kings, for example.
Right, good point. We call the Testament of Solomon pseudepigrapha. Basically, it's a text that claims to be written by a famous person from history or religion, but it was actually written much later.
It's kind of like if you had a best-selling historical novel, but from centuries ago. These texts were super popular, and they give us a look at how people back then viewed these legendary figures. But the interesting thing is, these stories, they often reflected real cultural beliefs, and they helped to make those beliefs stronger.
Exactly. The Testament of Solomon, it might not be considered scripture by most Jewish or Christian groups, but it shows us this fascinating world where wisdom, magic, and the divine, they all kind of blend together. In this text, Solomon uses his magic ring, the one given to him by God, to control demons and make them help him build the temple.
So it wasn't just skilled workers building the temple, but a whole bunch of demons working away on Solomon's orders. It's quite a picture, isn't it? And it really shows how much stronger that link between Solomon and the control of supernatural forces had become.
And this idea, it becomes even more complex, even more interesting when we look at how Solomon is shown in Islamic tradition. In Islam, he's a prophet, a very respected figure. And the Quran, it emphasizes how he had dominion over not just people, but also the natural world and even this unseen world of jinn.
We've mentioned jinn a couple of times now. Maybe we should explain what that means for anyone who's hearing this for the first time. Think of them as powerful beings, spirits with their own free will, who can influence what happens in the human world. That's the basic idea of jinn in Islamic thought.
And what makes Solomon's story so fascinating in this context is that God gave him this unique ability to talk to these jinn, to understand them, and even to command them. It's not just understanding what birds are saying or controlling the wind. It's about having authority over a whole world that's normally invisible and unreachable to humans.
It's like being given the keys to a secret kingdom, a place of incredible power and possibility. But as we know from Solomon's story, that kind of power, it's not simple, is it? It comes with its own challenges, its own moral questions.
And this brings us to a really important point in our deep dive. We've been talking about the good parts of Solomon's story. His wisdom, what he achieved, his control over the unseen world. But we can't stop there. There's another side, a darker side, a cautionary tale that's woven into the story of his later years.
It's like the downside of having so much power and influence, the fall from grace. What happened? What made Solomon's reign take this turn? What made this wise and powerful king stumble? It really makes you think, doesn't it? How could a ruler, someone who seems so blessed with wisdom, with this direct connection to God, how could he go wrong? What caused this downfall?
Yeah, it's a question people have been asking for centuries. How do you explain it, right? And the Bible, it gives us part of the answer, at least. It points to a series of choices that Solomon made. Now, scholars interpret these choices in different ways, but ultimately it seems like they led him away from his covenant with God. One of the big things that comes up is his relationships with all those foreign wives. Each one came with their own culture, their own religion, and it seems like this pulled Solomon in different directions, made him compromise, led him away from the idea of one God, which was at the heart of his faith.
So, yeah, not just a little love triangle, but this whole web of relationships, all these different influences pulling on him, challenging his beliefs, his loyalty. It's a good reminder that even the wisest people, they're still human. They can get caught up in complicated relationships, let their desires cloud their judgment.
Exactly. And this whole idea of Solomon's later years, it's become a cautionary tale. It reminds us that power, even when you have wisdom, even when you have divine favor, it's a double-edged sword, right?
Yeah.
You need to be careful, constantly checking your moral compass, making sure you're still on the right path.
It's a powerful message, not just for leaders, but for everyone. The choices we make, even the ones that seem small, like compromises, they can have huge consequences, shaping not just our own lives, but the legacy we leave behind. And speaking of legacies, it's amazing how Solomon's story still speaks to people today. It's constantly being reinterpreted, re-examined from different angles.
That's the thing about these big figures from history, from these ancient stories. They become these touchstones. They offer insights into the human experience that go beyond any one time or place. Take the whole question of Solomon's magic. Was it a gift from God? A dangerous tool? Or maybe just people misinterpreting advanced knowledge they didn't understand? People are still debating these questions today.
It's like we're looking at a gem with many sides, each side reflecting a different view, a different way of understanding the same story. We've talked about Solomon, the wise judge, Solomon, the master builder, Solomon, the king who talked to animals and commanded spirits. But at the end of the day, it's up to each of us to decide how we put all these pieces together.
And that's what's so great about digging into history, about exploring these old stories. They make us think critically, question what we believe, go beyond the simple explanations.
So, as we wrap up our deep dive into the enigma of King Solomon, we want to encourage you, our listeners, to keep exploring this for yourselves. Read those biblical accounts. Dive into the Testament of Solomon. It's a wild ride. Explore the Islamic traditions and how they view him. It's all fascinating stuff.
Check out the art, the music, the literature that his stories inspired over the centuries, and ask yourself, who was Solomon really? Was he a wise king, a master of magic, or maybe, just maybe, something much more complex?
Until next time, keep asking those big questions and happy reading, everyone.